Hello, everyone. My name is Tammy Kim. I'm an associate professor at Dartmouth College Tuck School of Business. I wanted to first thank the AMA AI SIG for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. In this video, I'm going to be talking about digital censorship on social media platforms and what that means for artificial intelligence. First, a little bit about me to give you some background context on how I think about the world and approach research. I'm a consumer behavior researcher, and broadly, I've spent much of my academic career thinking about unspoken expectations consumers have from businesses in terms of how they should behave. For instance, I've looked at consumers' beliefs about how social media platforms should handle consumers' personal data. I've also examined questions like how much say do consumers expect to have in companies' decision-making processes. And over the past few years, I've been especially passionate about studying consumers' expectations regarding digital censorship. Now, there are many forms of digital censorship, especially when it comes to different types of platforms, whether it be streaming, news, social media. And while I'm actually interested in all formats of digital censorship, in this video, I'm going to be specifically focusing on the type of censorship that occurs on social media, especially regarding user-generated content. So a quick agenda. I'm first going to give you a quick primer on the topic of digital censorship and define the scope of what will be covered in this video. Then I'll share some of my research from a recent published paper, and I'll wrap up by discussing the findings, implications, especially in regards to AI. So unlike other videos in this series, the research that I'll share itself won't have any AI component to it explicitly, but there could actually be several videos that explain the mechanics of AI and how they're actually used by platforms today for content moderation. But this video is not going to be on that. This video is very much going to be looking at the topic of digital censorship from the user's perspective. And I'll conclude by discussing what that would mean for the future of censorship when AI use becomes even more prevalent than it is today. So to give you a quick background on digital censorship, I'll just begin by stating the obvious. There are a lot of people around the world who are on social media, and there's a lot of stuff that is being shared on social media. The numbers on this slide really should not be very surprising to us. Now, much of the stuff that is being shared, they're totally innocuous, but many others, as we know, can be more questionable. For instance, we have a video of people swallowing Tide Pods, a video of someone being beheaded, a post including graphic details of violence, a person posing nude. And in fact, Reddit is actually full of threads with users listing different instances of getting their published posts being taken down by different platforms. So here are just some examples of user-generated posts that get flagged as featuring inappropriate content. In social media platforms, they have to decide whether to leave these up or take them down. Now, turns out it is quite difficult to come up with a censorship playbook that people are generally okay with. For instance, in what is also known as Nipplegate, there were a lot of mothers who were angry because the photos they posted of themselves breastfeeding their children were being taken down. Now, they were being taken down by Facebook because they were deemed too revealing. But the moms were really upset because they had not intended these photos to be porn. They were not uploading these photos to solicit sexual attention. They just simply wanted to share their experiences of motherhood. So this resulted in a lot of users staging several protests in front of Facebook offices around the world. Similarly, platforms like YouTube, TikTok, they've been taking down people's posts from war zones because they were deemed too violent. But actually, there's a large group of consumers who believe otherwise. They believe that these types of content actually should be allowed so that people can continue to spread awareness of what is going on around the world. And we can think about how this is especially relevant today with the rise of citizen journalism. So there's actually one quote from a Time reporter that I love that I think captures people's frustration pretty well. He goes, how can we refuse to acknowledge a mere representation, a picture of a horrific event, when others are forced to live through the horrific event itself? Now, censorship is fundamentally about having control over the content and the flow of information. In the past, this control tended to be more centralized. Governments and regulatory bodies, they dictated or regulated what could be published or broadcast on traditional media like print, radio, television, even regarding physical objects like American flag. And enforcement came largely from regulatory entities. And for instance, in the early 1940s, the US government had actually established the Office of Censorship during World War II to regulate information. Today, censorship looks quite different. With the rise of digital media, especially user-generated content, the process is much more decentralized. Platforms are setting their own rules, and this enforcement is carried out by many different agents, including algorithms, human moderators, and even users themselves through different platforms' reporting mechanisms. Now, of course, this is a simplified way of contrasting the past and the present, and there are many nuances. But it is difficult to dispute that the landscape of censorship has drastically evolved with the rise of social media. And because of these shifts in the censorship landscape, there are three key stakeholders that are affected. First, for users, and here I'm referring to specifically those who are primarily consuming and engaging with the content on social media, both over and under moderation can harm their experiences. Because if we think about it, if platforms remove too much content, users might feel the platform is too sterilized, but under moderation may make the platform feel unsafe and less trustworthy. Now, for content creators, when moderation policies feel too unpredictable or overly strict, creators may self-censor and they may avoid certain topics altogether, which could make it more difficult to grow their audiences or engage with their audiences. So this could potentially be a reason that content creators might defect to another platform that allows them more freedom. And finally, with advertisers, if content moderation policies disrupt user consumption patterns, then of course that's going to naturally affect how users engage with ads. So censorship in the past has oftentimes been discussed as a policy or ethical issue. But now, because of these stakeholders that are affected, it is my perspective that it is also a very relevant challenge for marketers. But really, there hasn't been a ton of research on this in marketing academia. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a key issue at the core of this discussion is coming up with content moderation policies. And many users feel that certain censorship rules on platforms just don't sit well with them. So when I began to do research on this topic, the first question I asked was, well, what do users believe in terms of how censorship decisions should be made on social media? So now I'll spend some time discussing a recent paper published at the Journal of Consumer Research. High level, this research involves both inductive and deductive work. I'll first introduce how I inductively generated a three-vector framework for making censorship decisions. Then I'll introduce my core proposition along with a quick summary of studies I've run to support this proposition. Now, the reason for the inductive portion was due to the lack of consumer behavior research on digital censorship. So I first began by identifying key dimensions along which consumers believe censorship decisions regarding user-generated content should be made. So to do so, a research assistant looked at different Reddit threads, just like the one I had mentioned at the beginning of this video, and compiled all the different examples they could find. So here in the yellow box, you can see some examples of these 82 descriptions. Participants were then shown a random selection from this list and asked what different factors should be considered when platforms consider whether or not to ban certain posts. And here the purpose was to gather as many different criteria as possible. On average, each participant listed about 4 criteria. And to make sense of this data, I then used a two-step qualitative analysis to identify key dimensions of censorship. What this entailed was first, categorizing participants' responses into 68 common themes by grouping synonymous responses. Then further clustering these categories based on conceptual similarity to uncover broader patterns in how people think about censorship criteria. Now, broadly, there were three big clusters of criteria that emerged. One cluster revolved around more black and white decisions, like whether a post contains curse words or involves illegal content. Another cluster centered around inferring content creators' motives behind creating user-generated content, whether they were being sarcastic or they're trying to generate hate clicks. The third cluster had to do with different types of outcomes that could happen from allowing something to be published. For instance, whether it would put someone in physical injury. So from these observations, I developed a three-factor framework for making censorship decisions: content, intent, and outcome. Now, based on this framework, we can theorize about and empirically test what might matter most to users. We'll first begin by thinking about content and intent. In the past, platforms tended to rely on content-based censorship, and their guidelines look quite familiar to us. Just like how people would decide whether a film or a show is PG, PG-13, or R, platforms would outline all the different attributes they would consider as negative or inappropriate, and then anything that contained those attributes. So for instance, these are just some rules that Facebook used to have in place. So if someone's bone was seen sticking out, or the word Hitler is used, these types of things would automatically be banned. In this research, I take the perspective that beyond content-based censorship, intent plays a crucial role in shaping how acceptable people find censorship decisions. And this perspective stems from a simple notion that social media is primarily used for conversations, whether it's with family, friends, or even strangers. And this became especially apparent during the COVID pandemic, when people turned to social media for social connection. And because of this, what I argue is that users would expect platforms to treat user-generated content as conversations and moderate content in a way that aligns with day-to-day conversation norms. Now, if we were to think about our daily conversations, communication goes beyond just the literal meaning of words. We constantly interpret other people's intent, picking up on things like sarcasm, humor, context. And because of this, I argue that users expect platforms to consider a content creator's intent when making censorship decisions, rather than simply relying solely on black and white content-based rules. What this means is that users are going to be less accepting of censoring user-generated posts that include negative content if they were created with positive intentions. Note that these are precisely the kinds of cases that have sparked backlash against social media platforms. They're more sensorially ambiguous. So while content-based rules would suggest that these types of posts should be removed, users believe that those same black and white standards can't really be applied universally across all cases. So for ease of understanding and to make sure we don't really get lost in the weeds, I'm going to show you some snippets of data from a series of deductive studies. Specifically, the key comparison I'm going to be showing you on the next page is how people feel about user-generated content that contains negative concrete attributes, such as eating Tide Pods or a post including explicit language, versus posts that contain these negative attributes but were created with positive intentions, such as being humorous, to express horror, or spread awareness about a war crime. And across different studies, I primarily used one of two measures: either the extent to which users are satisfied with a social media platform's decision to censor something, or how much they believe that a user-generated post should be censored. Now, if users truly believe that platforms should apply content-based censorship universally, then content featuring excessive violence, nudity, dangerous challenges, they should all be banned regardless of creators' intent. And in that case, we would not expect to see differences in people's opinions. But what we do see is a clear preference for intent-based censorship. For instance, people are significantly less likely to support banning user-generated content when it was created with positive intentions. And they're far less accepting, so these are the green bars, of platforms censoring negative content if the underlying intent was not harmful. In follow-up studies, I've also found that people's sensitivity to intent holds even when they're told about negative outcomes that could result from allowing content to be published. And this may be because what happens after something is posted. This may be because what happens after something is posted is oftentimes unpredictable and beyond the content creator's control. Also, in line with my earlier argument that people want platforms to consider conversational norms in censorship decisions, I also found in one study that this effect occurs because users expect social media platforms to engage in perspective taking, much like we do in day-to-day conversations. And additionally, I've also found that this expectation for intent-based censorship is context dependent. So in one study, I found that when platforms actively train users on specific community norms, this expectation weakens. And audience size also plays a role. When content is visible to a broad audience rather than just to one's family and friends, the context shifts away from being a two-way intimate conversation, and it becomes much more like a public broadcast where the same conversational rules don't apply. And in fact, what we see is that people are sensitive to intent and want platforms to abide by intent-based censorship if these user-generated posts that are in question are viewable by friends only. But this preference no longer persists as the context becomes less intimate as it goes from friends only to friends of friends to everyone, suggesting that there's this general expectation that platforms instantiate different censorship rules depending on users' privacy settings. Now, where do these findings leave us? While the research itself I just shared doesn't explicitly involve AI in any way, it actually does have a lot of implications for AI, especially given the big role that AI is currently playing and will continue to play in content moderation. So as we wrap up, I will need to spend some time tying my findings to AI and what that might mean for content moderation moving forward. Now, we can think about this connection in largely two different ways. First, we can think about how AI can help us implement censorship rules that's more aligned with users' expectations. Another is AI's role in censorship beyond simply aiding with binary decisions of whether to keep something up or take it down. On the first point, my findings suggest that platforms should especially invest in AI tools to better identify content creators' intent, whether it be intent detection through audience engagement, user history, and more human AI collaboration. And because users' expectations are context dependent, platforms should also move beyond one-size-fits-all policies and dynamically adapt. On the second point, I think AI's role in censorship can be really extended beyond simple removal decisions. It can be used preemptively, for instance, helping users revise content before posting through pre-moderation tools, such as pre-publication warnings and revision opportunities. I think AI can also play a big role strengthening user onboarding by educating users on platform norms and flagging harmful actors early. I think it's also important for platforms to consider alternative censorship methods that might be more palatable to users. This includes, for instance, leveraging AI to apply informational labels instead of just outright removal, which could enable more transparency and also gives users more control over what they choose to consume on these platforms. There are also some additional implications of my research I wanted to highlight. One implication is that platforms should continuously seek and incorporate user feedback, especially if they were to continue to rely on users to flag and report inappropriate content. I think there's also this need for users to transition from being more passive to more active information consumers. As we know, as the censorship landscape becomes more complex, what I believe is that users also need to be more critical and they need to be more engaged in how they interpret and interact with content on these social media platforms. And here, actually, AI can play a big role as well. And this can be reflected in a recent quote from Alexis Ohanian, who co-founded Reddit. So at a recent conference, he spoke about the future of AI in content moderation. And he envisioned a world where users get to choose their own content moderation algorithms. My findings also suggest that users treat these platforms like physical spaces where they have day-to-day conversations. And given this, I think we should also think about how the role of social media platforms is being redefined in society today. And we're currently seeing companies like Meta asking themselves this exact question as they reconsider and reassess their content moderation policies. And finally, I like to underscore the evolving nature of free speech as a constitutional right. Historically, courts have largely relied on content or outcome-based censorship when making decisions about free speech. But in the context of digital user-generated content, we're seeing this general shift where content creators' intent is increasingly important in the eyes of the consumers. So it'll be interesting to see what legal precedents get set going forward. In fact, an analysis of 49 court decisions on free speech actually support this mindset shift. So here what we found was that 76% and 82% of the free speech cases very clearly considered both the dimensions of content and outcome to reach the final verdict. But intent wasn't considered as frequently as 60%. But the majority of these cases, 84% of them, were actually considering or involving offline rather than online speech. And we're seeing a trend of intent playing more of a central role when it comes to online speech. So one example of this actually is one where an aspiring rapper ended up in prison for publishing his lyrics that contained violent content about his ex-wife. And this eventually made to the Supreme Court, where Chief Justice Roberts famously quoted lyrics from Eminem, asking whether someone can be prosecuted for negative content if their intentions were to create art. As I mentioned earlier, the topic of digital censorship has become very much a marketing problem, and there are so many questions in this domain that I think researchers could tackle. So I hope that this video, which was meant to be a high-level overview, is helpful in inspiring ideas for research. And I hope to connect with anyone who shares an interest in this domain. Thanks so much.